Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the sermon. Who has the first question? You have one right here.
You were saying that Revelation was an encouragement for people, the people who were persecuted. So that already happened, right?
Yes. Past history. We'll talk more about that, for sure. Most of Revelation, past history. We'll talk about that in our fourth sermon here. The sad thing is I'll only be spending one Sunday morning on it. But I trust that's going to be plenty for that. And we'll talk about how we got there. So after that statement that I just made, I'm still standing. That's a good thing. The Revelation is pretty much past history. We'll also address that a little bit when we talk about symbols. For example, Acts 2, sun shall be turned into darkness, moon into blood. What's that mean, symbols? Like Psalm 18 as well. You know, then the heavens, David says the heavens will roll up as a scroll. What does that mean? Isaiah, the trees of the field shall clap their hands. The tree's going to grow hands and clap them. What? It means something. What? So we will definitely address this. Make sure to come back for that one. Yes?
Your series here, your mini-series within the current 1 Corinthians is about post-millennial thought, and you concluded by saying that prophecy should spur us to action. That is the hope, and that is that is indeed our future. Just to close the circle, if you want to contrast that with other views outside of post-millennialism.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Briefly. Growing up in a small, if you're familiar with Elverson, just outside of just north of Route 23, between Morgantown, where we are now, and Warwick, if you will, going down 23 towards Pottstown and so forth. There's a little town called Elverson. It's so small that I've heard that in Philadelphia they tell Elverson jokes. Talking about small places. The name itself sounds super small, Elverson. There's a small little chapel there on the corner of Route 82. If you go into the center of Elverson, you turn right on Route 82 going south. You go for about maybe 700-800 feet. You take a sharp right on Route 82, and there's the first church that I really remember. It's called Twin Valley Bible Chapel, before it moved to Route 23 here. One of the first things that I remember is my pastor, Pastor McConaughey, who I believe loved the Lord. He was constantly talking about when he died. Now he's gone now. But I remember him constantly talking about, he says, I'm either going by the undertaker or the uppertaker. That was his thing. Meaning, either the undertaker is going to get me, I'll die naturally, or the uppertaker, meaning I'm getting raptured on out of here. And he constantly talked about the rapture and how he wanted to go by the uppertaker, and thought he would, because this is the last days and so forth. That never did happen, of course, with him. A godly man who I really believe loved the Lord. One of the first things I remember early on was these huge prophecy charts. They were huge. They went across the entire front of the auditorium. And for a little kid, and I mean the prophecy charts, I mean where's the fun in prophecy charts? The fun in prophecy charts is definitely the book of Revelation, right? That's definitely where the action is. And kind of scary for a little kid. And that's what I grew up with. And I never really got the call to action. We would have prophecy conferences, and these charts were huge. I wonder what happened to them. I'd like to get them. I'd like to see them again myself. They've probably been updated, which is an interesting concept, right? There's nothing quite as interesting a concept as the updated prophecy chart. That's interesting. In any case, I never did receive the call to action. It was always like, hey, just kind of like hang on. If there was a call to action, it was like just hang on to your seat here. It's going to get rough, but it's going to be okay because you're going to be out of here. That's the contrast that I see, but I want to bring it back to your question, Nancy. While I was there, and we'll spend a lot of time on this, but while I was at that church, we did have a prophecy conference speaker come. And he said, you know, you look at the beginning of the book of Revelation, and it says that this book is a blessing. And I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and I remember thinking, blessing? Are you kidding me? Every time you turn around, a third of the earth is getting burned up with something. These ghastly locusts with lion's teeth and long hair are coming out and biting everybody's lights out. It's just blood and destruction and famine all around, and you just barely recover from one problem going to the next and on to the next. But he said this. He said, it says it's a blessing. He said, you ought to really read this book and get the blessing out of this. And he suggested that we memorize it. And so I thought, naive kid, different from being naive adult, I guess. He said, you ought to memorize this. So I said, well, okay, because I'm not getting the blessing when I'm hearing these sermons. Maybe I'll get the blessing as I memorize it. So I began to try to memorize the book of Revelation. Didn't get very far. But what I did get was the first few verses would say twice that these things are going to happen very quickly. And I remember as a kid thinking, that's not what I'm hearing. We have two statements in verses 1 through 3 in Revelation chapter 1 that this is going to happen soon. That's sort of fermented in my mind, so that later on, when I began to understand the idea that Christ defeats his enemies in history, that's the key, in history, now it made sense to me that what's happening in the book of Revelation is John is talking to people who are now going to go through tremendous persecution, but the encouragement that they receive is that Christ, the one that they serve and love, is definitely not standing by, sitting on his hands. He is pouring out judgment on his enemies here on the earth. Now that's the contrast that John is pointing out here this morning. The contrast that the biggest one in other systems, if you will, is that sort of this idea that Christ is sort of sitting back. He's not so much that he can't do anything, but that he won't do anything. That it's in his plan for wickedness to triumph. And I know at one point, to John's question, I had to wrestle with this question. How does Christ feel about his enemies? Is he actively pursuing his enemies and destroying his enemies? Or is he sitting back on his hands while his enemies destroy everything else? Once I reached the conclusion, based on Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 mostly, which we'll talk about, once I reached that conclusion, I could no longer, and I'll just say it this way, I could no longer countenance a system that disallowed the victory of Christ over his enemies in history. And I would argue that other systems, we're getting into the weeds here, but we have to get there eventually. We're getting into it. I would argue that other systems ultimately allow the defeat of Christ in history. And they would never call it that way, would not say it that way. But in history, Christ and his church, of whom it's said the gates of hell will not prevail against it, that church ultimately gets squeezed and put down and trampled and pretty much destroyed in history. And that was an unconscionable conclusion as far as I was concerned, especially based on Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. And 1 Corinthians 15, where we have a reigning Christ. Paul told us right here, we have a reigning Christ who's going to destroy his enemies. You see, if Christ is at war with his enemies, one gets destroyed, right? That's what happens in war, right? In war, you have a winner and you have a loser when it's done right. Not like we do it, which is ridiculous. We fight the tie. I don't even know what that's about. Either Christ destroys his enemies or his enemies destroy him. And I believe other systems ultimately have Christ being destroyed, at least his people, being destroyed by his enemies. And I believe that's just, that's unconscionable. But I believe that's what happens. A lot of other stuff goes on there, especially the idea of the speculative nature of prophecy definitely concerns me a lot. And it should concern us all. That our job is to sit back on our hands while wickedness triumphs. That's not a good way. I mean, and even how about this prayer? Our Father who art in heaven, may your name be holy. Good? We all agree with that. Thy kingdom come. Cool? Thy will be done. Yeah. On earth as it is in heaven. Who dreamed that one up? You mean to tell me that we're to pray that God's will would be done on earth as every bit as much on earth as it is in heaven? I've got to sit back and think about that one. I had to at some point. I also had to think about the Great Commission. All authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore and teach all the nations. That's another contrast for me. The contrast is, see, a lot of systems say, well, we are supposed to go and teach the nations. The difference is some believe it will ultimately fail. The nations will be worse off in the future than they are today. We're still supposed to teach them, but it's not going to work out well. Or is it going to work the other way, that the nations will bow to Christ in time and in history? And it seems to me that the Great Commission says they will bow to Christ in time and in history, because he's given that command in history. Go therefore and teach all the nations, because I have the authority to make sure it gets done. All authority is given to me in heaven and earth. I got the authority. I'm telling you to do it, and I have the authority to make sure it gets done. That sort of answer your question? Okay. Who else has a question? I can see you're on the edge of your seats for the rest of this sermon series. Hang on. I know you have them. Don't let them go out of your heads, because you're going to want these questions later on. You are definitely, and I'll, of course, I'm always around later. Who else has another question? Let me reiterate. I'm not here to bury everybody else's millennial views. My initial job is to ask you to consider whether or not what I'm sharing with you is a valid biblical position. That's really how I'm starting out on this. Might not be how I end up, but it's certainly how we start. And you can see in our church documents too how we feel about this. I thank you for your kind attention here this morning.